Welcome to Critical Magic Theory, where we deconstruct the wizarding world of Harry Potter because loving something doesn't mean you can't be critical of it. I'm Professor Julian Wamble, and this is part 2 of our Ronald Weasley exploration, y'all. And we are back with the illustrious expert of Ron Weasley herself, Dani Alexander. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm happy to still be here. Moments from the last time I was here.
It's amazing what one can do when you just hit a button and all of a sudden it feels like time has moved forward.
Magic.
Do we have time turners? Technology, the true time turner. We are going to dive right back into our discussion about Ron Weasley. But first, we've got to take the next 25 seconds to bop along to the theme song. So get your shoulders ready. Even if you're driving, you can bop a little. And let's do this thing. We need to talk about Harry Potter. I hope you danced. Again, I want to make the caveat that the Ron Weasley that we are talking about in this part 2 is going to be mostly book Ron, not fan and Ron, not movie Ron, book Ron. And there are important
Boo, movie
distinctions.
Ron.
Boo, movie Ron.
Sorry, I had to interrupt. I was so upset. I had to
Do
interrupt.
it. Sometimes you just gotta get it out. That's what we're talking about, what repression does to the soul.
Yeah,
And I think we just have
we're
to say
repressing nothing here.
nothing. Everything is coming out. Okay. This this second episode is gonna be chaotic, and that's the energy that I need. So I'm ready. I'm not editing out the chaos. So I want to begin with thinking about one of our favorite Ron moments, and I'll go first. One of my favorite Ron moments is when Harry finds out that Snape is going to be the referee for the Quidditch match in Sorcerer's Stone slash Philosopher's Stone. And when he goes back, because he's like shaken to his core, and he tells Ron and Hermione, and they're like going through solutions. And Hermione says, "Oh, just pretend you broke your leg." And Ron goes, "Really break your leg?" And every single time I lose it because he's like, "Why even fake it? Like this is life or death. You need to make sure that there is absolutely nothing that this man can do to you." And I think, based on the conversation that we had in part 1 of this episode, is that this is a moment that really speaks to Ron's loyalty to and just like what it means to be a good friend, where he's like so worried. He's like, "Listen, don't fake it. Just break it." And honestly, I love that so, so,
Don't
so
fake it,
much.
just break it.
Just break it. Words to live by. Um, Depending on what you're breaking, we're not going to get into it. It's fine. But I just love that moment because I think it really does embody who he is as a friend, where he's like, you need to do whatever it takes to stay safe. And we know, or at least we believe that we know that Snape is a threat to your safety. And so you need to kind of protect yourself. And if that means actually breaking your leg, then frankly, so be it. And I just love that that was his recourse, was like all of the magical things that one could do. And he's like, nope, just break your leg for real. And that will solve this problem. And I don't know, it just is one that every single time it happens. And the way that Jim Dale narrates it is so funny to me. Um, I love that moment so, 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 so much. Dani, what is one of your favorite Ron moments?
I'm torn right now
Mhm.
between two.
Share both.
So, one of my favorite Ron moments
Mhm.
speaks again to another controversial thing about Ron,
Uh-oh.
and it's how much he argues with Hermione. But one of my favorite moments is when Hermione learns about house elves. And she is like hair on fire, like, I'm going to fight for justice. And they get to Hogwarts and she learns that the food is made by house elves. And she goes, I'm going to stop eating. I'm going on strike. I'm not going to eat. And Ron's like, okay.
Yeah.
And literally the very next morning, she comes in and is like buttering a piece of toast. And Ron's like, what's that about? I thought you were striking, huh? And I love it because it's one of my favorite things about their dynamic. He always calls her out when she's being a little hypocritical.
Yeah.
And her heart's in the right place. Of course, no one's arguing that. But he sees that she's a little bit of hot, has a lot of hot air in that moment. And he's like, yeah, I called that. And it keeps her humble and keeps her honest and keeps her from becoming overly self righteous. And I kind of love that
Yeah.
about the role he plays
Yeah,
with
because
her.
I think Hermione, what's true is that sometimes like she lacks accountability. And I say this as a person who like is very good at talking myself into anything and justifying any of my behavior. I think that having a
Mhm.
friend who's like, actually, no, you just kind of made that up, is it's very helpful in keeping you together and humble and
Mhm.
accountable for your behavior and your actions.
I love that about him, and I love that part especially. And then the other one is just very simple. I think Draco's making fun of Harry, I think is what's happening, and Ron just picks up a crocodile heart and, like, hauls it across the room and smacks Draco with it. Eh, chef's kiss. Chef's kiss moment. I love it.
That is really funny. He's like, why even go through anything else? We just need to like give me that crocodile heart. Okay, so we're going to dive right back into the arithmancy lesson. Again, for those of you who haven't listened to part one, first off, go back. Maybe after this episode, you don't have to do it in order, but like we said some really good stuff in that episode. So you need to like go and listen to that. But again, for those of you who haven't listened to that episode yet, there were 1,002 responses, which is unbelievable. And so we're going to start with the question of, is Ron Weasley a good pureblood? As always, this question never disappoints. And it always leads to like some pretty much equal divide. So about 38% said yes, about 36% said no, and about 26% said don't know. I love this question, y'all. I know y'all hate it, but I absolutely love this question because I think it really gets at the heart of what I hope this podcast does, which is invites us to think about what does it mean to be a good anything? But in this case, it's hard because pure bloodedness is so confounded with negative things. And I think what's true for the Weasleys is that we tend to attribute very positive attributes to them. And some of them are deserved, and some of them are just because we love them because they're nice to Harry. And so the question of like whether or not this group of people are good purebloods really invites us to think about what does it mean to be a pureblood person and how is it that we can then understand the nuances of that. And I think that Ron is a complicated character in this regard, and I find myself a bit conflicted in the way that I answer this question. Someone wrote, the reason I say he is not a good pureblood is because I feel like it depends on how we define good pureblood and by whose standards. I typically define it by the standards of pureblood supremacists, as these are who I feel place the most importance on pureblood values. Ron and his family are generally more positive towards muggles than other pureblood families. In addition to this, Ron ends up dating Hermione, who is muggle born. So, according to the pureblood supremacists, he would be considered a blood traitor, which, by traditional pureblood values, is negative. This is mostly my reasons for categorizing Ron as a bad pureblood.
First off, this is a question I never would have thought about until you started bringing it up in your videos. And it's been very compelling to consider by the metric that, that commenter was going on. Yes, I agree. Terrible, bad, pure blood. But if you think of it from the context of what makes you a good member of any power class. I think it is, what are you doing to support the oppressed class? In that regard, while Ron has a lot of learning to do, and I'm not saying he's like a muggle born activist here, but he lives by example with he doesn't really see anyone who is muggle born as any different. He constantly praises, Hermione's exceptionalism, and he fights on the side of the people who are standing up for muggles. And he's learned that, I think, through his
Mhm.
family, who, again, imperfect, but trying. And I think that's where he lands.
I definitely agree, and I think one of the things that I maintain about the Weasleys in general is that I think that they are not pure blood supremacists, but they are magical supremacists, right? Like, I think that their beliefs about people who can't do magic are not great, and I think what I love about Ron with regard to this question is the fact that he really shows us, even more so than Draco, like what it is to be socialized as a pureblood.
Yes.
And I think we see it pop out in certain moments. Like when he finds out that Hagrid is part giant,
Mhm.
his very initial reaction is so instinctual. He doesn't have time to filter it to try to make it come off as something that isn't like prejudiced and biased.
Yeah. Same with Lupin.
Yeah, and the same thing with Lupin, right?
Mhm.
So we see in this moment, despite how his family kind of thinks about, muggle-born people, that there are some things that are harder for them to shake. I mean, we see them obviously bring Lupin in and really kind of accept him as a member of the family for
Mhm.
all intents and purposes. But I think that that initial kind of unfiltered knee-jerk reaction that we see from Ron tells us such a very specific story about how his pure-bloodedness plays in his kind of own understanding. And again, I know that he is a child, but I think to be perfectly honest, his being a child allows for
Yes.
us to really see the truth. Because I think when you are a child, you're so much less considerate of what is socially acceptable. So to see him in these moments like champion, you know, not using derogatory terms towards Muggleborns, but also at the same time holding some of these more negative prejudiced views that have to kind of either be corrected or kind of shifted a bit. I think tells us a story, and in that way, like, I think he is a good
Mhm.
pureblood in a bad way, right? Like, I think that he kind of still has some of these things. That's the nuance of it all, right? Is that, like, you can be someone who is not necessarily anti-Muggleborn, a la the Malfoys, but who can still hold some of these negative views, and they didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah. No. I'm nodding vigorously because this is so true. I think
Yep,
anyone who would say that they haven't had like a prejudiced or uh, thought in their life is a lying liar, because we just absorb these things like a sponge,
yep,
even if we are not raised with an explicitly prejudiced mindset. And those moments you brought out are so strong because we then see how much of a champion for
yep,
Hagrid Ron is, and how, if someone calls Hermione a slur, he's going to immediately, no questions asked, attack that person, Draco Malfoy. Um, so I we see him learning, we see the nuance, and I think that's very powerful.
I mean, we know that the magical society is outrageously segregated.
Mhm.
They don't interact with muggles at all. All he knows is are these truths. And we know that giants have been exiled. We know that werewolves have been exiled. And so he doesn't come into contact with a lot of these other magical communities at all. And so, in some ways, right, like he is a byproduct of a social system that is kind of built on pure blood supremacy. And it's only when Harry's like, dude, Hagrid is our friend. And Ron's like, oh, right. No, of course, like, I know this person. So now
Mhm.
I have known him for 4 years, that he has to really be checked, and I think what is great about Ron in both of these moments is that he's willing to correct and
Yeah,
recognize, like, "Oh, this
that
actually."
can't be understated.
No, it
Like,
can't be. because there are a lot of people who would not correct and who
Yeah.
would say, "Oh, this person has just been lying to me and hiding their true nature." And that's not
Mhm.
what Ron does. Ron actually does correct himself and does kind of pull back and say, "Okay, like maybe we need to walk it back a little bit." And I think that, especially at that age, that is saying something because normally those kinds of things, especially like in the real world, don't happen until you go to college and realize like, everything that was happening where you lived is not what's happening everywhere else. So to do it at 14 and 13 is, did I hit home?
I think back to high school me, college me, my world was rocked when
It'll do it.
when I went to college,
Yeah.
and so many people were, and you're like, "Oh, wow. I've been
Yes.
taught so many wrong things."
And so I think for a lot of the time that we spend with Ron, we see what it is to be the product of society that privileges purebloods. And I think what we also then see in him is a transition from like a good pureblood in the bad way to a better pureblood in the good way, right? And
Mhm.
I don't think that that journey is ever really over, but I do think that we get to see in him kind of what it looks like. And I always tell my
Yeah.
students, I'm like, when the bar is Death Eater, it's so easy to clear. And so I think that so many of us
Yeah.
bring to this question this idea of like being a good pureblood is not being a Death Eater. And I think that there's so much more nuance to the idea of that. And I think Ron
Yes.
embodies that in a lot of really interesting ways. And I think each of the Weasleys tap into a very specific kind of purebloodedness that invites us
Mhm.
to kind of think about what it means to be pure blood and be a quote unquote good one. And I appreciate them for that because I think sometimes we extend too much grace to them, but I do think that it's nice to be able to see kind of the nuances of pure bloodedness in a different context. Because if we were to juxtapose them with the Malfoys, obviously they're sunshine and rainbows. The next question is Ron Weasley a hero? So about 59% said yes, 29% said no, and about 12% said don't know. Danny, what do you think of this?
I There was a quote that I
Mhm.
loved from the comments that says, "I think Ron is like Sam Gamgee. He's not the main character, but the main character would have fallen a dozen times over without them there."
I loved that one
It
too.
is so succinct and so perfect, I
Mhm.
think, for Ron's role. And to be quite honest, like this question to me isn't even a debate. He's a hero. He's a hero. Like the number of times he put his life on the line for Harry, stood up alongside him, stood up for his friends. He didn't go kicking and screaming. He leapt at the opportunity to defend and show up and go into harm's way alongside his friends, spiders aside. Even that he did it,
Yeah,
even though he did not want to.
yeah,
Um, and I have a couple examples.
do
I
it.
don't know if that'll derail,
No.
but one of them we talked about in the last episode, which is in the Shrieking Shack.
Mhm.
And the movie did such a disservice by taking these moments away from Ron. But this is when they're in the Shrieking Shack, they're facing Sirius, who they still believe to be like this maniacal murderer. And he stands up with a broken leg and declares, "If you want to kill Harry, you have to kill us first." He's like clutching to Harry with a broken leg as he says this. Hermione's next to him saying, like, "Shh, be quiet, stop it." And then he doubles down and goes, "Did you hear me? You'll have to kill all three of us." And it says he said it with like this weak voice because he was in so much pain, but he was like, "No, I'm going to make this clear. Even though I can barely stand up, I will fight you." And in the movie, they gave that to Hermione, which was really frustrating because it's such a strong show of Ron's character.
Mhm.
Another is in The Half Blood Prince, another moment they gave to Hermione. At the very end, Harry's implying he's going on this Horcrux hunt alone. And Ron and Hermione are just kind of looking at him dumbfounded. And then Ron's the one who says, "We'll be there, Harry, at your aunt and uncle's house, and then we'll go with you wherever you're going. We're with you, whatever happens." on the run in Deathly Hallows, he tells Hermione he'll put her on his family tree and help her like train her on the whole family tree so that they can disguise her as a pureblood and not a Muggleborn. He throws himself in front of her when they're being attacked by Death Eaters inside the cafe once they escape from the wedding. He at one point she's like saying she's going to go forage for mushrooms, whatever the stuff they're eating, and she's like, it just makes more sense if I go
Oof.
alone. And it says Ron snarls like, no, you will not go alone. And I'm like, okay. He's
Wait,
I
I
know
was
he's so
affected by that.
protective. And then finally, like, gosh, at Malfoy Manor, when Hermione is being tortured for 3 straight pages, it talks about how Ron is screaming, banging against the walls, yelling up at the ceiling of the cellar, Hermione, 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 Hermione. When he finally gets free, he bursts into the sitting room and disarms Bellatrix Lestrange. Like, this man, this boy, I'm not going to say he's a man because he's a boy, is a hero. I,
The defense rests.
that's what I was going for. The defense
The
rests.
defense rests. Like, I think the case has been made, the evidence has been
Yeah.
presented.
Yeah. Bang the gavel. See you later. Bye.
What is fascinating to me is that some of us were less willing to kind of give him the flowers of being a hero in the comments on the grounds of, like, his motivations, like, why he was doing some of this. And I just want to point out something that many of us brought to bear in the opposite direction for Percy. And in the spirit of keep that same energy, I just want to bring this up.
Mhm.
Many of us were so willing to make the claim that Percy was a hero because he saw the error of his ways and came back when it mattered. And I want to point out that we need to keep that same energy for Ron. One of the things that I've said on numerous episodes with regard to this question for numerous characters has been the Weasleys have very little stake in the battle with Voldemort because Voldemort isn't going to kill them because they are purebloods. So if they sat out, they would obviously be seen as blood traders, but they wouldn't lose their lives. They probably even wouldn't even lose their livelihoods because they are part of a protected class. So anything that they do to disrupt and
Mhm.
undercut what Voldemort is trying to do is heroic because it is unnecessary for them. And in the moments where we see Percy make choices and then come back, Ron make choices and then come back, and then still fight
Mhm. Yeah.
is heroic because not only did they not have to come back, but they didn't have to lay their lives on the line for anyone. They could have just not. And we know that there are many pureblood families who maybe don't support what Voldemort is putting out into the world who didn't fight. And there is something to be said about that behavior in and of itself being heroic, being brave, because it is so not required. And what one has to confront when making that decision is goes beyond, like, the normal, and Ron takes it even further than anyone else in his family did in terms of how he went about being heroic, and Danny gave us amazing examples that kind of predate the Wizarding War, but also, I think I would be remiss to not point out the fact that, like Percy, when it counted, Ron returned, and then had to confront his fears and concerns and insecurities in the form of a Horcrux, a soul-sucking device, and did it, and saved
Yes.
Harry, did that, and I think that yeah, no, I don't love that he left. I don't. I don't.
I have I don't know if this is an off the wall thought, but like, do we see this parallel between Percy left and tried to tell Ron to leave and Ron was like, "No." But then Ron left
Hello.
and like Percy had to come back tail
Mhm.
between his legs with that remorse. Oh,
there's something about leaving
Yeah.
that requires a person to, in the solitude of their own insecurities and in their own space, to truly reflect on what's
Mhm.
important. And I think that what's true for the Weasleys in a lot of ways is that the like privileges that they do have kind of make them unable to see kind of what they have, right? Like that's the thing about
Yeah.
privilege, right? Is that it's so invisible that you don't really recognize like the privilege of having a loving family and friends that care about you. And I think that
Mhm.
there's something about leaving. It's the leaving that feels cowardly, but it's the coming back to me that's the most heroic. But not even just the coming back. Every time that we've
Yeah.
seen these characters come back, they come back with a new sense of self and have done the work of figuring out who
Yes.
they are. And I will say that that's one of the things that we love about Fan and Draco.
Oh,
And so
are
again,
you
let's
going
keep
there?
that same
I
energy.
know.
I'm just saying, I just want us to keep that same energy when it comes to Ron. People are gonna get so mad.
I know.
It's okay.
I'm like,
I want us to keep that same energy. So much of what we see, right? Like the great comeback is a big deal
yeah.
within the Weasley clan, and it's they don't come back the same. And I think that that's so
Yeah.
important.
And a great comeback also doesn't have to be a dramatic 180-degree
Yeah, yeah,
comeback.
yeah.
It
Yeah,
can be the gradual dismantling of harmful behaviors, opinions, worldviews, and years later, you are a more mature person who has paid your dues for the mistakes that you made, and now you're doing better. And that is just as honorable.
yeah. And when you're doing it by yourself, both for Ron and for Percy, right?
Mhm.
Like there is the solitude of these moments are the things that really kind of force them to appreciate what they had. It's the great comeback that I think really stands out to me in a number of dimensions, right? Like we see these moments where Ron, again, even in Goblet of Fire, where he had to come back to Harry and say, like, hey, I'm sorry.
Mhm. And you notice he always doubles down. Like, when
Yeah,
he comes back after making a mistake, he goes, like, that extra
yeah,
step to
yeah,
show how remorseful he is in his actions. Like, in, Prisoner of Azkaban, after that he has this huge falling out, Harry and he both have a falling out with Hermione.
yeah,
On the other side of it, Hagrid, like, tells him, like, "You boys have not been treating her well."
yeah,
And they recognize it, and then Ron is in that library as if he was Hermione Granger
yeah,
researching how to protect Buckbeak. Like, you see Harry's commentary after Deathly Hallows when he comes back from the Horcrux that he's like, extra sensitive and kind and sweet to
yeah,
Hermione, like trying to be like, he knows he's in trouble. He
yeah.
knows he's done wrong and he's doing extra steps to redeem himself. Like, he doesn't just come back and be like, I'm here. Nah.
And this is a perfect segue into the final question, which is Ron Weasley a good friend? Again, divisive.
So
I
divisive.
wasn't prepared. So we've got about 40% who said yes, about 48%, sheesh, who said no, and about 13% who said don't know. Danny, I, I
I have to
yeah,
ask, are we asking if he's a good friend or if he's a perfect and infallible person? And this is where we talked a lot about how not approaching these characters with our, not adultifying them.
mm-hmm,
But I think this is an instance where our adult perspective is actually very
mm,
beneficial because, we've had friends that we've been friends with. I my best friend of 20 years.
mm-hmm,
And we have hurt each other. We have said unkind things intentionally and
sure,
unintentionally. And we still show up for each other. We still work through the
yeah,
conflict and we learn and grow and move through it. And it just seems so shallow to me to see a person who shows up over and over and over for their friends and say he's a bad friend because he calls Hermione a know-it-all, because he left them in the Horcrux hunt, because he got jealous over something that was, pretty dramatic, like with the Goblet of Fire. And then going back to our question in the last episode where we talked about why do we offer more generosity and grace to Hermione and Harry over Ron? Hermione and Harry wronged each other and Ron in all the same ways, different ways, but all the same gravity of ways. But I think it's like we're taking these moments and making these moments speak to an entire person's character. And it's like how when someone's mean to you, you only remember the mean thing they said, even
Yep.
though 98% of the time they're not mean to you. So I don't know.
Yeah.
This one really shocked me because it's like, is this how you treat the people in real life?
I think the Horcrux hunt was a thing that came up in a lot in the comments, and I will admit that, like, that is something that also deeply affects me
Yeah.
and my perception of Ron, and again, I don't think that that's wrong, but I think
Yeah.
what I'm feeling compelled by is this idea of, somebody said, like, no one is the sum of their mistakes. And I think what is true for Ron that I think is so unfair is that we really do allow all of his mistakes to dictate everything about him in ways that we don't do for Harry,
Yeah.
that we don't do for Hermione. And it comes back to what we talked about in the last episode, which is this idea of, like, because his loyalty as a friend is not prized as much as, say, Hermione's intellect or Harry's
Yeah.
determination, we don't give him the privilege of the benefit of the doubt that we give them when it comes to the things that they do. And so it allows, then he doesn't have the kind of buffer that we give to other characters in these books because we don't necessarily see the beautiful moments that he brings to bear as being
Mhm.
beautiful enough or exceptional enough.
Yeah. Loyalty, humor, steadfastness, like that's all fine and good, but like I said in the last episode, it's not something we lay in bed at night and fantasize about. We wanna be the best. We wanna have all the accolades. We wanna be the person that people think of when they think of who is exceptional in this area, and Ron is just not that. He's the solidly average, sometimes above average, normal dude who makes mistakes, learns from them. Sometimes it takes several times before he learns from
Yeah.
them, and it's just so painfully real that I think it may make it hard for people to forgive him because there's nothing shiny and bright overshadowing his flaws.
And this makes me wonder, are we looking for something shiny and bright to overshadow his flaws? And because we cannot find it, we are livid and we punish him. And I think that this makes me think of when I ask my students, what are the differences between Ron and Draco? And why is it that we're so much more forgiving for Draco than we are for Ron? One of the things that one of my students said was Ron is supposed to be that friend, that friend that is going to be with you through thick and thin, the ride or die. And I think that we have pointed out time and time again moments where Ron has done that, but it's not sensational because he also has major transgressions on the grounds of his friendship. And so I wonder if it's possible that part of the disdain that people have for Ron is that the exceptional piece of his character and his personality is meant to be his loyalty, is meant to be his friendship. And we see it come up, but it is fallible, it is flawed, and it is not always there when we want it to be, in a way that Harry's determination is always there, even when we don't want it to be. And Hermione is always smart. But Ron's friendship, it is always there, but it doesn't manifest in a way that feels perfect. It doesn't manifest in a way that is not without its flaws and failures.
Yeah, I think that's hugely insightful, and I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. There's the determination, the intelligence, and then he is friendship. And so when he falls short on friendship, we are going to hold him to such a higher standard. And when Hermione and Harry fall short on friendship, well, that's not who they're supposed to be. And I think that's a little reductive of Ron's character, but I understand why people may have that expectation.
I also think it's reductive of Harry and Hermione.
Yeah.
I think that it's like, I wonder what would have happened if in a moment Hermione had failed to do something that was intellectual,
Yeah.
right? Like, what would have happened if she couldn't have conjured those Horcrux books, or
Mhm.
the spell to the undetectable extension charm had failed, or the polyjuice potion didn't go right? Like,
Yes.
would we have? Because she brewed it correctly, she just administered on
Yes.
herself
That's
incorrectly.
so true, and there was a comment in the, what we talked about in the last episode, and I'd love to bring it back
Mhm.
up here, where it says Ron is the friend, so his friendships are the ones who are tested and explored the most. He gets to be disloyal because if Harry or Hermione were, or in this case, if they failed in their title, their mission,
Yeah,
the narrative structure would fall apart. And so we do get to see them be bad friends, but they're not, that's not what's expected of them.
yeah,
So they
exactly.
can. That is I think it's very a poignant observation.
And part of friendship, and, like, especially ones that last long, is recognizing, like, there are gonna be moments where you're not gonna be able to show up for your friends the way that they want you to, the way that you thought you would. There are gonna be moments where you have to take a step back.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I don't always love Ron's execution, but I understand the
Yeah.
motivation.
The heart is
And
there
yeah,
usually. Um I one thing that comes up a lot is that Ron is only friends with Hermione because she does his homework. And like, yeah, there are times throughout the books where he's like, "Well, you just finish this, or can I just copy off your paper?"
I hate those times.
I you what?
I hate those times.
Yeah,
They just
and as that girl in school, I'm like,
mhm,
"Ugh, no, do your own work. I worked hard on this." Like that feels very real to who I was as an adolescent. Um, but it also discounts like the number of times Harry walks into a room and Hermione and Ron are gabbing away, laughing out loud. They go to Hogsmeade together. Harry shows up at the Burrow. Hermione's already been there for days. Like, it completely ignores the fact that Ron and Hermione have an entire friendship outside of that isn't contingent on Harry's presence. Another point I want to bring up is a lot of people talk about how much they argue. And I don't know if people listening can tell. I love a good debate. And when
who
I
doesn't?
do have a point to make, I can sound very intense. I internally am feeling so chill. I am feeling no type of way about it. But externally, I come across as very intense. Is she raising her voice? Like, no, this is just my volume. Um, I grew up in a household where debate and argument was how we bonded and related. But so many
Yeah.
people have avoidance of conflict. So they see Hermione and Ron having
Mm.
an argument. And instead of, and I'm not talking about like a real fight, like over, scabbers and crookshanks, but like just the petty little things they go back and forth on. A lot of people won't look at that and see that as relationship building. It's just conflict, confrontation, and all of that is bad. So I think that's really interesting how people perceive the two of them because yeah, they do have a level of antagonism with each other sometimes that like they would have to mature through. But for the most part, I'm like, yeah, they just love an argument. They love to hash it out, and that's fun.
Yeah, and I think that what's true about arguments in general, or debates or what have you, is like, even when you're having them, if you're having them with people who you like believe care about you, then you know that there's a baseline,
That's
right? And you
it.
know that you can always come back to this kind of homeostasis where it's like, no, but yeah, we were having, and it got heated, and that you listen. I'm a person who also is like, will fight it out with
Yeah.
my
I mean,
favorite people.
we've never like argued, but there have been exchanges between us where I'm like, I disagree with you, Julian. And you're like, that's
Absolutely.
interesting. Or you'll say
Yeah.
something and I'm like, that's interesting. Hmm. And then we go back and forth about it.
Yeah, and I think, to me, that's learning. There are gonna
Yeah.
be a lot of people who listen to this episode who are in whatever transportation vehicle or sitting at their desk or however they listen, who are yelling back at us right now,
Yeah.
who are very heated with
Be nice to
these
me, y'all.
things.
I am sensitive.
I am not sensitive, so go for it.
Go
That's
after
wonderful.
Julian, be
Go
nice.
after Nate.
They both love to argue, and it's like Hermione is the type who will steamroll and kind of her like self-righteousness and her like belief that she is so right. She will steamroll. I find that relatable. And Ron is the one who like pumps the brakes and is like, "Excuse me. Let's track that back for a second and like bring her back down to earth." And then on the other side, you have Ron, who's very hot headed and will like kind of fly off the handle about something. And Hermione, who's like, let's think about this logically, calm yourself down. So I think there's just a good balance there. Like I said, I think some of their fights, yes, they're real fights. They're not handling it well. It's immature. It's showing a lack of emotional intelligence. That's the type of thing that we see them, they should grow through. And then there's another type of argument between them that is two people who love to hash it out. Ron grew up in a family of 6 other siblings. He knows how to fight.
Yeah. And I think it's also, we experience it from the perspective of Harry, who
Hates confrontation
hates
deeply.
confrontation, and also you never saw it from Petunia and Vernon because rarely did they disagree because Petunia would just do whatever Vernon wanted. And
Mhm.
so the idea then that like he's so bad at dealing with confrontation, and so it all feels, and I think this is something that people often to like bring to me in comments about posts that I make is like, well, it's all from Harry's perspective. And I think this is a very important moment where recognizing his perspective as the kind of narrator of the text is important because I think he sees everything through the lens of like meaningful, hurtful, deep confrontation in ways that probably just isn't
Mhm.
true. And I think that you're right. Like, I think that some of these things are just Hermione wants to be right. And I get it. I love being right. It's
I
like,
love being
ooh,
right.
it's oh god, it's nothing better than being
I
right.
got a tingle up my
Me
spine just
too.
thinking about how much I love
I
being
just love
correct.
it. And I think that and Ron needs to be right. I think that
Mhm.
there is this desire and this, like, fervent need to validate so much of his thinking, his existence, his presence, his like, all of those things, and that when you put those 2 things together, oh, they're gonna go there, and I think that we have to kind of recognize again, they're children, 1, but 2,
Yeah.
their personalities are ones that really do kind of invite fireworks sometimes. Because they're not gonna relent, they're not gonna let up,
Mm-mm.
and when they are onto something and they believe it, they are gonna go for it. But I don't think it undermines how good a friend Ron is to
No.
both of them. I think it is part of their friendship. I have friends
Yeah.
who I am going to debate with you all the time. We are gonna fight. It's what we're gonna
Yeah.
do, and we know that that's how Sirius and Lupin were because Snape mentions it, and so there are
Yeah.
just some friendships where you have those dynamics, and I know we have them. And again,
Yeah.
I'm sure that there are people right now who are like, it's not the same. And I invite you to shoot me an email, write it in a comment, go for it. We love
Yeah.
engagement.
I think it cannot be understated, and it is so important to re-emphasize what you said a little bit earlier about how when you have these exchanges with people, it d- it is so contingent on the baseline of trust that you
Mhm,
have with each other.
mhm,
Ron may say, "Hermione, you're a know-it-all. Just shut up." But he isn't going to, on purpose,
mhm,
say something to tear her apart for the sake of it. Neither is Harry, neither is Hermione. There's always something behind it. When they truly say something mean to each other that like pokes that bruise, there's usually something in their own insecurities and failings that is being exacerbated and prompting them to do that. They don't hurt each other just because. And when they do hurt each other, they realize this person loves me and cares for me and has shown up in so many other ways that they're having a moment and we're going to move past it. And I think kids are far more forgiving of those mistakes than adults. And it's something that we're coming from our adult perspective. I've seen people say, if a man talked to me the way Ron talked to Hermione, and I'm like, do not tell me that 13-year-old you would have stood up to the little boy in your class like 30-year-old you would to a man you're trying to date who's going to be insulting to you. Like
and
it's completely different things.
this is the thing. and this is the thing, and so, okay, this is the perfect segue. We're segueing right in right now to our
Let's
reflection. We're
go.
moving there right
I'm
now.
so ready for this one.
'Cause I think that the question that we have to tackle, and I think that one of the things that we've talked about, on and off the pod is what is it that we as adults are bringing to these characters that either prompts us to extend grace or to revoke it and kind of only extend animosity and anger. And I think you tapped into something here, which is this idea that reading it as an adult, we we are taking the characters that we connected with as kids and making them us now.
Mhm.
And so we're expecting the responses and the actions and the behaviors that they are giving as 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 year olds for us as, late 20, early 30 somethings. If you don't fall in that age range, that's okay. We're happy that you're here. But I just happened having to look at the analytics. I know the demo. But that there is that we are expecting our own reactions from teenagers, which are not the reactions that we would have given when we
As
were their age.
teenagers.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on as I thought about Ron and kind of my own feelings about him, and these 2 episodes have really done a lot of work, in helping me navigate some of it, but I also recognize that, one of the things that I obviously bring to bear here is that, I'm Black, and so that is meaningful, in terms of my understanding of some of these characters, and one of the things that really stood out to me about Ron is and the more I've reflected and not only am I a Black man, but I teach on race, so because of that, it's, everywhere for me, um is that, his privilege is something that I struggle with, and I think that watching some of the things that he, does and, gets away with, and that we as a fandom are like, "Well, he's just a kid, he'll grow up and grow out of it."
Mhm.
I've always felt like I've never really kind of, resonated with that, and I have many videos on my TikTok that are like, "When do we get to hold them accountable?" And I couldn't figure out the why that question was a big one for me. And I think it's partially because so many black and brown children, whether they be boys or girls, don't get the benefit of the doubt of being children and not having to take
Mhm.
responsibility for our actions. And to that end, we grow up much faster.
Yeah.
And so for me, my expectation for Ron is born out of my own experience of someone who really didn't get to have the childhood that was kind of footloose and fancy free. And so I see some of the things that he does and I'm like, this is I don't get why you get to be forgiven for this. You should be responsible. And some of it feels fair and some of it is not fair. And I think that it's not Ron's fault that society doesn't allow certain people to be able to be children and that he got the benefit of being able to do that. And I think the juxtaposition of him and, say, a Harry who really didn't get to be that much of a kid because he had so much placed on him by society really kind of encapsulates the way that I tend to look at Ron. In that I think, yeah, I feel like sometimes it is unfair. And I think that there are a lot of moments where Harry would want to be Ron
Yeah.
and just get to do whatever he wanted and not worry about it and just be normal. And he says that a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that resonates with me as an adult that I think I didn't connect with when I was a child, which is yeah, I would have loved to just kind of mess up and not feel like my mistakes were going to cost me something great because society wasn't going to back me up the way that it was going to back up Ron. And I think
Mhm.
when I think about what we bring to bear, I think sometimes there are really solid critiques to leverage, but I think that in other moments we have to be mindful of the fact that some of it is us. That's something that I need to talk to my therapist about, and I
Yeah.
can't place it on this kid, this character in fiction,
Fictional kid.
this fictional kid, right? And
Mhm.
say you need to be because it's not fair, and it perpetuates cycles, and it perpetuates ideas that are not great and are toxic, but also are not the fault of children,
Yes.
both fictional and real.
Yes. That I mean, snaps, 10, 10, 100%.
I practiced that.
Yeah, that was really good. I did not practice this, but
Go for it. Do it.
as a woman,
Mhm.
I see how the traits that Ron's character displays as a kid, the temper, the jealousy, the possessiveness over that's my friend. Hermione was supposed to be my date, like that. If we take these actions of this adolescent, but we transpose them on an adult, that's when it becomes very toxic and abusive. And we know far too many men who are fully grown
Talk
who
about it.
act like a 14-year-old Ron Weasley.
Talk about it. I was just about to write that down. Talk
Yes.
about it.
Yes. And it's like, I think we can come in and we see this character acting this way, and it just rings far too true to how we see grown men acting
Talk
that we
about
have
it.
we shut down, no grace, no understanding. And like, I have to always, like I said, I think these characters really challenge my empathy, and Ron challenges my empathy. But it's like, I have an incredible husband who is so conscientious and thinks about women's rights and thinks about the misogyny that maybe was ingrained in him through how he was raised and the culture he was raised in. And he addresses that. Do I think a 14-year-old version of my husband was like that? Certainly not. So I think it really comes from like our own experiences, and also where, when it comes to fanon, where our
Mhm.
imagination will let us go. Because some people take those behaviors of his temper, his possessiveness, his jealousy, and they can turn him into a villain, because those can be the basis that can be a basis for
Bases.
a villain. Uh, that can be the basis for a villain arc. It
Yeah.
can also be the basis for learning and growth and becoming a person who knows better as an adult.
Oh, whew. You did it.
Do I
And
get snapped? No.
because I think that this is it. I think that so many of us, whether it be on the grounds of race, whether it be on the grounds of gender, experience grown Ron Weasleys who act like 14-year-old Ron Weasley.
Ugh,
And
ugh.
on the
Like,
grounds of on again, on whatever identity grounds, we know them. And I think that where we're struggling is our ability to disentangle the fact that it's not 13-year-old, 14-year-old Ron Weasley's fault that 37-year-old Billy
oh,
is is acting like the same. You know, that it's not his fault
it's
that we
not.
know a grown version of the 13-year-old version of him. And I think that again, like this kind of umbrage syndrome where we bring our experiences in on these characters. And I think that what is so difficult is because, again, Ron is so normal and so relatable. We see him now as grown people and we're like, this is unacceptable. So that when you read the books again, it's hard to make the disconnect because you're
Yep,
like, actually, this 14-year-old who is throwing a fit because he's, feels betrayed by his friend is acting just like the 42-year-old version that is my boss.
yep,
And I and it brings out something in us. I think it triggers something in us
it
that
does,
feels like,
yeah.
and I think that, like, yeah, I'm like, I look at Ron sometimes and I'm like, "You are the mediocre white dude that, like, is mad that I got an opportunity that he didn't." And I feel that, and I'm like, "But that's
Yeah,
not the character's fault. That
no,
is that dude's fault." And I think that we conflate those things sometimes in
very
ways
much
that
so.
are hard to kind of disentangle. And so, well, we
I
cracked the code.
I think we did.
This has been another episode of Critical Magic Theory. Thank you so much for listening, and special thanks to our guest for 2 episodes, y'all. Dani, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to spread the good word about Ron Weasley.
I am just I feel changed, y'all. I'm not gonna say like I'm a baptized, like pro Ron, but at
Yeah,
least I have some sense of why I feel the way that I feel, and that feels important.
that's growth.
It is growth. Dani, where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, so I'm on TikTok at Holy Gnocchi and on Instagram as danny.reads.things.
Everyone needs to go and follow her if you already haven't. Especially if you are a fanfic reader, like you need to get into it because
Yeah.
the Hermione fix, the Drary fix, the First Prince, for those of us who know what that is, we're not
Oh,
even gonna
yes.
get into
And
that because that's a whole nother thing. And
the Hot Ron
the Hot
fix
Ron agenda.
that show who he could become if he matured through his issues rather than becoming a 42-year-old Chad.
And that is the Ron that we all need to be about. Also, I need to point out and thank my friends Mark Miller and Niles Luther for the amazing music. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, first off, thank you. Please feel free to write to what? To write comments, to subscribe, to follow, to do all the things that one does on pods. And if you want to continue this conversation, feel free to follow me at Prof W, PROFW on TikTok and at prof.jw on Instagram. Next episode, we'll be talking about Ginny. Get excited, the it girl of the series. We're going to be getting into it. Have a great 2 weeks. I'll see you then. Until then, be critical and stay magical, my friends. Bye.